I'd like to open the floor for questions now. Any questions? For any individual on the panel or for the panel generally?
I have a great concern for what's going on with our young people. And because, I'm supposed to be an elder, I guess, trying to understand, what this mess is we're leaving for the next generations and the generations to follow. Increasing the dialogue around suicide, because that's, our Indigenous people are also being affected in great ways on that conversation. Conversations around bullying, conversations around intolerance, all of these things are not things that I grew up with. And so our generation is like, well, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to help? Because it's just not something we were familiar with, at least not in my generation with the people that I knew. So I hear conversations around critical thinking, and that seems to be great. I'm just not sure what else we could be doing from our generation.
So what's your question?
What can we do?
All right.
There we go. There you go.
Anybody?
Specifically about suicide, she was asking? Just about these concerns that affect you.
Yeah.
Well, I'll pass initially, and then I'll pick up in a second.
Sure. I don't have much of an answer other than I think you can facilitate, as an educator or a religious leader of any sort, you can facilitate a discussion that you're not an expert in. I think that's what all of us were saying. It's a lot about sharing views and personal experiences and events in our lives and coming to an understanding together. A lot about looking at the other person in front of you and opening your heart to them and receiving who they are. So in those ways, I think preparing for this talk, a lot of people asked me about how, when I was discussing the topic with people, about how I think curriculum in schools should change. And I don't necessarily. I think it's an environment and an atmosphere that needs to be encouraged more so than anything to have those sorts of discussions in a healthy and constructive way.
Yeah, I want to kind of reiterate that Ronnie said we're not experts. And when the doctor was introducing us as experts, my anxiety shot through the roof because I'm just a guy. I don't know that much, but I think it comes back to creating these spaces for dialogue, because we know that the problems are not the views themselves. The problem is that there is a lack of place to talk respectfully among one another without fear of the criticism that might come out of that dialogue. So to me, I think it just comes back to creating those social spaces and making it clear that this is a safe place, wherever it is, that people can express themselves and talk about these issues. Like you mentioned suicide. I don't think there's a way we can kind of break that down now, but in terms of what causes suicide and what are the issues that are behind it, the mental health issues, and I think a lot of these things will come down to depression, and if they have more spaces to talk about these things, that is maybe a more pragmatic way to deal with it, instead of instilling like a fear of God, for example, or things like this.
I guess what I'd like to sort of add to that is that we have an awful lot of seniors in Nova Scotia. We have more seniors in Nova Scotia than any other province, but they're feeling isolated, they're feeling alone, and these would be great ways to engage conversation with them so they don't feel isolated and alone, and they're actually feeling like they're contributing. So if I can inspire you to participate with seniors, both from their own communities and from the communities of ours, there's not a lot of people out there that would just love to have a conversation with them.
Thank you very much for your comment and elaboration.
I could add a little bit as well. Sure. With regards to those concerns that you mentioned, for example, suicide or other issues that youth might be dealing with, I find the kind of rule of thumb, to use a terrible phrase, of dealing with it is, first off, not divorcing them from the agency which they have and the ways in which they feel empowered. And in particular, that means the experiences which constitute their understanding of themselves are intimately tied up with that self-definition. And so if you do things which sever that link between their experiences and their realities, and just say tradition says this, period, I find that's very disempowering, and it's very painful for them. So in most cases, and I'm usually not in the capacity of a faith leader. I'm usually in the capacity of a professor at a secular university. So usually the way that I advise them to approach the problem is to say, well, first off, it's complex. Islam, for example, if you are dealing with the issue of suicide, there have been Muslims who have committed suicide historically. How has the community then dealt with that? There are Muslims today who are committing suicide acts of violence and are using very particular forms of justification for making those arguments. So the key for me is for a student to try and complicate the way that they're approaching any particular problem as much as possible to force them to come up with an answer themselves. Because if I put my authority as this is the definitive answer, they can check up on Wikipedia and in 6 minutes prove me wrong, right? So it's a very silly position for me to take, a very firm position against my students, and rather I find empowering them is teaching them the ways to filter the massive information which we have available to us constantly and refocus it. And with regards to engagement with seniors, at least a number of my courses that I teach at St. Mary's are open to the public. And especially are best attended by seniors in many cases. And it creates unique spaces for dialogue because youth are able to kind of interact with people who are at the kind of the other end of the spectrum of anxiety, right? About all new issues. Bowel movements are the problem here, and whereas here it's more, will I get a job, right? So that they can speak to each other on very different purposes. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. Any questions at the back? Yes, Rabbi? Be nice to hear from you from a different perspective now.
Well, I don't know if it's different. I just actually want to first say thank you to each of you for doing such important work. Pedagogy is paramount in getting people to a place where they can critically engage and ask questions for themselves. And especially with the first talk, I was really thinking a lot of one of my heroes, Paulo Freire, and kind of how he approaches pedagogy. So thank you so much. I wanted to process, this is more maybe a comment than a question even, some feelings I had during the second talk. I'm speaking not so much as a rabbi or as a professor, but mostly as a parent right now, thinking about education for my own child. And I just moved from the US, where we're suffering some of the worst rhetorical disasters that the country's ever witnessed. And hearing some really hateful rhetoric on our media outlets, in our schools, pretty openly, in open spaces. And as much as I'm committed to a culture of pluralism and certainly promoting dialogue, that is of course the most important, I do think there are times, even in this culture of moral relativism, when there are things that are actually wrong. And there are things that I wouldn't want my daughter discussing as a debate. An example I might think of from a bygone era in the US is people who claim in the name of religion that African Americans should be enslaved. I think that's wrong. And I'm not going to debate that. As much as I'm committed to debate. Likewise, I don't think of human rights as a discretionary value when it comes to the rights for gays, lesbians, bi, queer, trans to marry. And so thinking just through the mind of a parent, I guess I would encourage us to think a little bit about what are the lines, what are the kind of lines in the sand for us, each of us, where relativism might break down. You know, to encourage the spirit of debate, but to think about ways where our society will be kept loving and non-oppressive to people whose voices will be silenced in an environment where we encourage people who might share hateful views to speak in the same way. So.
Thank you, Rabbi. Rabbi, you had the opportunity to chant a lot and sing a lot as well. So together we will say, if you've been happy with day one, you will be happier with day two. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, then your life will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. If you're happy and you know it, reach for the stars. If you're happy and you know it, reach for the stars. If you're happy and you know it, then your life will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. My brother.
Thank you. Just to comment on what you say. If you look at the facts, we are not giving direction to our kids, our youth. Mostly the direction comes from the TV, come from the internet, come from the friend. What mom and dad do, like you sit there as a doctor did, and he give a speech. And the speech with the kids is never work. We need action to transfer what you say to action. And that's a little bit hard because the time they spend it with their friend, with the school, don't allow to you to sit with them a long time and be friend. So we have to be so careful how we treat them. Maybe you treat your oldest son different than the youngest. Depend on where he is involved, what influence he has, who's a friend with him. It's a little bit hard to say one thing and forget the another thing. As I told you again, now I say the internet, the friend, the school, the neighbors, they have more influence than mom and dad. So we have to know how we be so close to them and open their heart to say what they have deep inside. And after that, you reach the point you want to reach. It's not easy to say it in a few minutes, but generally, that's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, as we conclude, my brother has a question here, or a comment.
Thank you very much to all the panelists and for the way you are moderating, Dr. Sankar. You really make things enjoyable. It's now with, when the first speaker spoke, I had point and question. Now the other speakers spoke, so I'm all over the place. So I'm going to try to see if I can bring this together somehow. So one thing I take out of this, and it relates to also what I do, is engagement with communities in their own terms, which the first speaker said. I think that is very, very important. If we want to engage with communities, usually we set the boundaries behind our desks and then go to communities and say, we have engaged, and get the tick mark and get money from the government and do what we want, and it leads nowhere. That's why, despite the intricacy of multiculturalism into the Canadian life and what it has gone through and up to where it has come, we are still seeing so many holes in this whole concept that the second speaker said that you are free to stand and say terrible things about someone's religion, which is true in theory, but in practice it's only about certain people's religions, which we know, because in other people's religion, if you say something, Christians and Muslims, you can say. If you say about any other persons, it's not the same. And I'm not saying we should be saying it, but I'm just saying also that our society is not all at balance when it comes to that. The one thing that I did not very much get is this notion of you have to decentering of self when you get involved into dialogue. Decentering of self is almost an impossible thing to do, because every parent grow their child and try to center them around something. So by the time you, the professor in your university with your curriculum, receive this 19-year-old, he or she is already built with something, all right? So because people don't go empty. So you cannot ask me to tell my child or myself to decenter myself because I want to engage in debate. I have to center myself, otherwise I have nothing to debate about. So actually, my aim with my children, I have a couple, is really to center them in my belief. That is just the duty of the parent. You think, because I believe in it, I chose it for myself, and it's worked good for me, I have to choose it for my offspring. I think it will be good for them. Now, when they are in university, whatever they learn to mold themselves and become wherever they are, that is a totally different thing down the road. And there are a few other things about these centuries of Muslim alcohol production. I don't know which Muslims we're talking about, because Islam is from Indonesia to California, and I don't know what statistics are there to support that. And I'm saying that genuinely because it has nothing to do with alcohol, folks. I'm talking about facts. So I'm hearing some things here and there. I'm wondering what are their origins. And the Canadian Islam, and I don't know as opposed to which other Islam. So I'm just saying here, our choice of words, maybe Canadian Muslims and the way they practice or interpret is one thing, but Islam, I think to everybody, if you say I'm Canadian, it means you believe in the values of Canada. Otherwise, you're not being very truthful. And if you say I'm Christian, you must be believing in the values of Christianity. Otherwise, that's not comprehensive. If you say I'm Buddhist, you must be believing in the values of... So the same thing, if you say I'm Muslim, you must be believing in Islam. Yeah. So you can't have one Islam here and one Islam somewhere else. But interpretations that are based on qiyas or istihsan or all the other jurisprudential categories is something that can come down the road. So sometimes culture actually becomes law, and traditions becomes law as long as they don't hurt and they don't oppose the basics of the tenets of the
brother,
path itself.
may I?
So I'm going to keep it right there.
Yeah.
So these are just, like I said, when the first speaker spoke, I had poignant questions, but when everybody spoke, and then I got all over the place. But thank you very much for what you've provided for us this afternoon.
My brother here is diversity coordinator for Healthcare Nova Scotia, and he had diverse comments as diversity coordinator and diverse questions. And the question of centering that he had strong opinions about, I will center him now by asking him a specific question for the panel rather than lapsing into diversity. Do you have a question for the panel, my brother?
I think I got the question. Yeah, that's my
okay.
question.
He thinks he got your question.
In the capacity that I would speak about the diversity of Islam or the diversity of Muslims, I'll just give you one good example. You specified this kind of, what is the tradition of Muslim wine drinking and consumption, for example. So if you were to look at a coin from Mughal India of Aurangzeb, he's on the coin, his image, so first off, a human image is on a coin, being made and manufactured by a Muslim ruler, and he's holding a wine cup in his hand. And then underneath it is written, the defender of Islam. How do we make sense of an image like that, right? So from a historical perspective, I'm trying to, as much as possible, say, if this person is claiming that he's the defender of Islam, in his capacity as an emperor of Muslims, what does it mean for him to have a wine cup in his hand, right? So just from that perspective, when I'm sort of speaking of the diversity of the tradition, we know that Muslims consume wine. We know that Muslims consume alcohol. So then what are the traditions by which Muslims consume alcohol? What are the ways that they make sense of it, make sense of the act, negotiate with the act? All you would have to do is go to any bar downtown and you would find Muslimish names who've used credit cards to buy alcohol there, right? So how do we deal with that fact? On the other side, in terms of the decentering of the self.
So let me just say that you said centuries of Muslim alcohol production.
Yeah.
Every people will drink alcohol.
Yeah.
So it's the alcohol production and an image of the coin. Who told you that it's alcohol?
His cup is in the British Museum. It's a wine cup. It says in it, for the consumption of wine. That's how I know.
Second question, centering.
But as with regards to this question of centering, it's an academic exercise. It's an exercise that's appropriate for a secular university in which we're conducting a class on the Islamic religious tradition. What I mean by that is to sort of do a little bit of an archaeology of the self, right? To figure out, why do I feel this way about religion? Why do I feel that, for example, with this panel, why do I feel that homosexuality and marriage can't go hand in hand? Or why do I feel that it can go hand in hand? By exploring my own motivations and my own understanding, then I can approach a perspective where I can try and understand someone else's perspective on that as well. And decentering in that way is important because I don't want my students to feel like their beliefs or their faith is being attacked. However, if they want to offer it up for public scrutiny, then there's a certain strategy by which I will scrutinize it, and not just flay them for being a bigot, ideally.
Thank you very much. We have a question that's been waiting for some time. This lady here has a question. It's nice to hear from the other side as well. Miss?
First of all, thank you very much. All you panelists actually helped me to see things in a different way. My path, and many of you know me, has been long coming on how to create many of the things you're saying, spiritual diversity. And I needed the tools to help me move forward in that path, and you helped me today, and I want to thank you for that. The question I want to put forward, and I think there was a reason I was meant to go last, is exactly what happened today. How can we have, if we do not have tolerance, understanding, and respect amongst ourselves, then how can we go out and create that in other diverse communities? My point is, we have to start within our own communities, our inner religion, before we can actually go out and promote it to other religion. If we don't have unity amongst ourselves, how can we promote it outside? And I want to thank you for the tools that you gave us, but that's a question that our leaders need to answer, and our leaders need to work on. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. You have more of a comment than a question. My question in concluding for the panel is this. The question here for the panel was the question of empowerment for social change. The youth. That has not been covered adequately. The tools were not given, all the tools that you need. From mentoring, we had a culture of critical thinking, delegation of power, so forth and so forth. And now there is a crisis in the youth that requires urgent attention. The youth from university who are graduating, there'll come a time they'll work for the mafia, and they won't see that as an ethical contradiction. The ethical crisis in our society is mostly by the highly educated people in law, in business, in government, in every field, and not by the fisherman, not by the carpenter, not by the farmer. So the question I'm asking, empowerment, especially empowerment that is based on ethical literacy, must start with a moral compass. And you cannot be morally ambivalent or state of moral inertia or skepticism without passing on a moral compass to the youth to empower them for the future or their leadership potential in the future. So my question to them, why is it the university has become an abattoir, a slaughterhouse of the moral intelligence, moral imagination, and moral vision of our students? The highly educated are the people associated with the ethical crisis in every field of human endeavor globally. Question then or comment?
I'm still not sure what the question is. Well, I'm not clear what the question is.
The question is, we have to empower the youth. And nowhere have I heard in the panel about this ethical crisis in society by the educated, the highly educated. And nowhere have I heard about the possibility of equipping them with a moral compass to guide their church choices in the future, or about ethical literacy as a dominant goal in education. Because the question for the panel was empowerment of the youth in universities and schools. So this question of ethical literacy is very critical, not only critical thinking. Critical thinking, by the way, is the heart of a democracy and the heart of ethical thinking. So on that note, I call on our convener to tell you what's going to happen tomorrow. And thank you for your presence here today, for your participation, and tell you how happy we are with you today. And tomorrow will be a happier day and a sunny day.
I know you guys are in a hurry. Sorry, I am in fact beginning to feel a little like Elizabeth Taylor's seventh husband. I mean, after so much that has been said by speakers and panelists, what can I say that's going to be, or what can I say or do that's going to be different? Okay. Now, in any case, I know that all of you are going home with a point of view. One of the things you've seen is very, very clear, is we have commonalities dominating all faiths. Spiritual values are all the same, which is compassion, love, brotherhood. And yet, we find hate threatening the world. And it bothers me that if from a growing culture that's germinating in Canada, if God is going to be a word that cannot be mentioned in the public square, I fear to think what kind of a society we're going to create for our grandchildren. But more of this will be talked about tomorrow. Tomorrow, I think, yes, Dr. Anne Boyles will be speaking on true prosperity, the role of religion in promoting the material and spiritual well-being of mankind. That will be followed by another keynote presentation, the complexity and messiness of the human journey. Then, of course, in the afternoons, we have a couple of panel sessions, which is human rights and our relationship with the earth, gender and religion, and how do faith groups see see women in society, or see the role of women in society, and finally, do race, creed, and ethnicity derail or clarify religious intention? So let's look forward tomorrow. Thank you for coming here, and thank you all for being here. Yes, I'm repeating that. And you want to close the conference, Kim? Yeah.
All right. Once again, thank you so much for all of your care and your efforts and your good heart in engaging in today. And I wonder if we could just take a few moments of quiet just to appreciate how we are at the end of the day and to appreciate the benefit we've experienced. So please. And with grateful hearts, I invite you to feel the sense of sharing this goodness outward to your family and friends, to your community, sharing it outward in the world, wherever it's needed. When Catherine Martin was here and she did her wonderful ceremony for us, she called on all of our relations who have gone beyond to come and join us and support our day, which I think they've done a wonderful job. And now we want to send them off to return. So please drive safely home, and we'll look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you.